So, good afternoon, everyone. It's wonderful to have you here as always. I'm Janice Kaminer-Resnick, and on behalf of Jews United for Democracy and Justice and Community Advocates, Inc., I welcome you to tonight's America to Crossroads virtual town hall program. I think tonight is program number 95 for 95 consecutive weeks. Thanks to our leadership team, former Congressman Mel Levine, former Supervisor Zev Yaroslavsky, David Lair, Caroline Kelly, and Rabbi Ken Chazen, and to all of our co-sponsors. With so much at stake this year, it is especially exciting to welcome back two of America's most respected political analysts, Bill Kristol and Ron Brownstein. Thank you both for joining us tonight. We really appreciate it. Next week, February 23rd, we are excited to present Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and author, The Atlantic's Bart Gellman. On December 6, 2021, Gellman created shockwaves with his article, which was covered extensively in the media. Trump's next coup has already begun. Why January 6 was just a warm-up. Madeline Brown will be our host as Gellman will share his theory about Trump's post-2021 insurrection plans to control America. On March 2nd, we'll resume our frequent discussion about voter suppression as we welcome attorneys Benjamin Ginsberg, a longtime GOP election lawyer, and Bob Bauer, former White House counsel to President Obama and co-chair of the Presidential Commission on Election Administration. They will be in conversation with longtime, recently retired NPR election correspondent Pam Fessler. Their topic, safeguarding free and fair elections. Two leading election attorneys, a Republican and a Democrat, discuss the future. Full unedited recordings of all of our programs can be found on our YouTube channel and on our website. And we always provide an easy to use link, which is provided in every email that David or I send. I want to remind everybody not to unsubscribe from our emails unless you don't want to get the Zoom link for the programs, which I know you do because I get your emails. When you unsubscribe, you cannot get that email. So be sure not to do that. If you do it, send me an email right away and I'll resubscribe you. Be sure to look at our activism section of our website, JewsUnitedForDemocracy.org, for links to lots of organizations who are engaged in fighting for voting rights and for our democracy. There are many volunteer opportunities and lots of great organizations to support. Now, please welcome my wonderful partner, David Lair, who will tell you about a couple more upcoming programs and introduce tonight's guest. David?
Thank you, Janice, and thank you all for joining us for this evening, a program where we learn how serious analysts assess the events that swirl around us every day. It should be a fascinating hour. In 3 weeks, we promised an informative and likely contentious panel discussing the fate of affirmative action. Professor Rick Sander of UCLA Law School, the author of the seminal study Mismatch, will engage in the debate on the future of affirmative action with a leading proponent of those policies. It'll be moderated by KPCC's Larry Mantle. The following week, March 16th, we'll host a frequent guest of ours, Congressman Adam Schiff, who will update us on events occupying the Congress's agenda, from the January 6th investigation to the Ukraine-Russia confrontation to Build Back Better. He'll be in dialogue with the LA Times Pulitzer Prize-winning Pat Morrison. And a reminder, a bit further out, we'll host former chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Mike Mullen, to talk about Ukraine and our military posture in the world. And he'll be followed by another expert on foreign policy, the New York Times triple Pulitzer Prize columnist, Tom Friedman. There is much ahead on America at a Crossroads. Tonight's discussion will be led by Bill Kristol, a man who's been described as the intellectual Brahmin of the modern conservative movement. His thoughtful analysis has led him to be a commentator on ABC's This Week, a columnist for the New York Times, a regular on CNN and MSNBC, as well as the founder of the Weekly Standard and editor-at-large of The Bulwark, among other accomplishments which are far too numerous to list. I recommend for those of you who enjoy our programs, his twice-monthly video conversations with thinkers and newsmakers, Conversations with Bill Kristol. They're masterful interviews with the most thoughtful people around. From Lawrence Summers to David Axelrod to Robert Putnam, he covers the intellectual and political landscape and does it well. And now, the aforementioned Bill Kristol.
Thanks, David and Janice. Actually, I've done 2 or 3, is it, Ron? Conversations with Ron Brownstein, and we've analyzed the 2018 elections, the forthcoming 2020 elections. I'm a little worried about going back and looking at those, but I think they stand up pretty well. I'm hoping they do. Anyway, it's great to be back.
By the way, one of them was the day Anthony Kennedy resigned.
Yeah, right. That turned out to be a pretty important, interesting moment. Yeah. Anyway, it's great to be back with you all, and great to be here with Ron, who I've known a long time, one of our leading journalists and analysts. Those are rarely combined. There are a lot of very good true leather journalists who really dig into the data and go around the country, and Ron does all that. He also is a first-rate analyst, student of history, political science, and has actually well-informed opinions about these matters, which he sometimes keeps to himself when he's doing his reporting. But I think here he'll be a little more maybe open. Author of many books. You should read him in The Atlantic and elsewhere. But his most recent book is actually not so much on politics. Rock Me on the Water, 1974 that was the year Los Angeles transformed. Allegedly transformed, because Ron is partial to Los Angeles. Right. Movies, TV, wasn't music, movies, TV, and politics. Is that right? Yeah. But you've discussed that, I think, on this.
We did. We have discussed that right here. Yeah.
And that was a cheerful discussion. I don't know if we can quite stay up to that level of good cheer. So we'll move quickly. There's so much to cover, and obviously they'll think we things we just leave out because we don't want to. We're not going to just try to cover the waterfront. But we'll talk a little bit about the Biden administration, about the elections in 2022 and 24, and then really save some time for the bigger picture on what's going on with our parties, especially perhaps the Republican Party, the conservative movement, and the fate of democracy in this country, which is Ron and I are old enough to remember when we just discussed tax policy and
tax
foreign
rates.
Policy and who was up and down and the governors and senators, and we didn't really have to get into these quite as big picture questions, right?
Yeah. Bill, do you remember we first met? I'm pretty sure it was 1986 when you were the chief of staff at the education department. I think you were chief of staff for Bill Bennett.
I was for Bill Bennett. Yeah.
I was writing a piece in National Journal about the young conservatives in the Reagan administration, and both of us have seen a lot of development since. But certainly, it does feel like we are in a different era. I mean, we are exploring and debating questions that we have never had to ask before, which is what is the character of American democracy going to look like in 4, 6, 8 years, 2 years time? What is the role of violence in American politics? I mean, the proliferation of threats that we're seeing, municipal officials, school board officials, local health officials, election officials, so many things that seem to be kind of set in stone. All that is solid, as someone said, melts into air. Things that seem to be set in stone suddenly seem at risk, and it's a strange continuation of the Trump presidency in that way, right? Because I think one of the things about the Trump presidency that was so striking was we thought that there were all of these safeguards and guardrails that limited a president who was going to be arbitrarily exercising and abusing his power. And it turned out a lot of those were just kind of paper mache, and they really required a kind of a collective will to enforce. And that collective will isn't really there in one party at the moment. And even Democrats, I think, have been uncertain about how far to go in enforcing all of these rules, as we see by kind of the debate over what Merrick Garland is doing. So, yeah, I think, we've been doing this a long time, but I feel like what we are in now is unlike anything we have been writing about or active in before.
Yeah, and analytically, it's hard to sort of do justice to the, granular, discrete things that are happening. There's legislation here and elections there, and then the big picture stuff, and then they mix together in unpredictable ways. I think it's a very fluid moment. I'll just say one quick story about sort of how different things are. My friend PJ O'Rourke, whom you know too, Ron, died yesterday, unfortunately, at age 74. He was a contributing editor of the Weekly Standard for, I think, almost our whole existence, and wrote many, many pieces for us. Really a wonderful writer and a very funny guy, but really a wonderful person, actually. And so I was talking with someone about him today, and this person remembered a panel discussion that PJ had at AEI, the American Enterprise Institute, a center-right think tank. It was unusual because AEI is usually doing serious things on tax policy and foreign policy, and this was kind of a funny thing on politics with PJ, Rob Long from Hollywood, and Andy Ferguson, my colleague there, Matt Continetti. I mean, a lot of people. Tucker Carlson was on the panel. And this was, I think it was May of 2015. So 2 months before Trump came down. And, there were some differences with Tucker at that point, but it was still like one kind of friendly. No one thought much of it. Tucker was a little more anti-immigration than the rest of us. Other people had different views on some issues. But the idea that we would be, the whole movement would have just broken up and people would have gone to where they've gone to in it's only 6-7 years. It feels like it's been a long time, but anyway, just was striking. It was a good point he made that you couldn't imagine such a panel today.
First of all, PJ O'Rourke, was one of those writers that other writers say, like, come on, just save some for the rest of us. I mean, just incredibly witty and, just beautiful prose and, just sparkling in that way. But I feel like in some ways, one of, if not the macro story is the conflict or tension between what we just said, that we are clearly in a different era where we are looking at threats to democracy that really don't have exact precedent in American history. And our political system just has not adjusted to that new reality. I mean, just everything about our political system has not. The media
systems in a way don't. That's what it means to be a political system, is to have things settled. And then you fight within the lines, right? It's like a football game. Right. And if that's all up in the air, you don't quite have the system you thought you had, right?
And we are just really having trouble adjusting to that. I mean, I think, the political scientists who study, the democracy analysts are the most alarmed group in the country, because they see many of the democratic backsliding that occurred in places like Turkey and Hungary and Venezuela and Poland. They see a lot of the same conditions here, but it is really hard to find any other group in society that is acting that way. The business community is kind of treating it as business as usual, literally. I mean, in states where Republicans are making it harder to vote or making it easier to, or enhancing partisan control of election administration, they're still giving to the people doing that because they're going to cut their taxes, and they're going to give them less regulation. The same thing at the federal level. The media, I think, is just having a really hard time acknowledging the reality that you have I don't think the entire Republican Party, but the dominant faction in the Republican Party is an openly anti-democratic movement led by Donald Trump. And there's just no capacity. And even, Biden certainly is struggling with that. I mean, he spends more time trying to normalize Republicans than insisting that he can work with them, than raising alarms about what they are doing. He's been very slow to pick up on the broad array, which we're going to talk about in a minute, what's happening in the red states. So we're in this weird period where the game has changed, but most of the players are refusing to acknowledge that. And I think for the people who are worried about the shifts in the boundaries, it's just an enormously not only anxiety inducing, but frustrating period, because there's just no evidence that voters see democracy, see this as a tangible vote changing kind of set of circumstances, right? And so without that, you have the prospect that you will have elections in 22 and 24 decided on the normal terrain of, are people satisfied with the direction of the country or not? And if they answer no, you may get a result that changes the character of American democracy forever, even if that's something that nobody's really voting for.
Yeah, I mean, if you just think about what happened since November 3rd, 2020, since Election Day, I mean, it's really, we talk about so many other things, building Build Back Better, legislation, this, that, the Biden administration, Democrats have some problems. Well, if you step back, it's really, I think, as you say, a social scientist, a historian who came down from Mars, and what's going on here? Trump lost the election. He tried to overturn it. There was a riot at the Capitol inspired by him and his people, really, and behind the scenes, I'd say even more dangerous stuff happening, stuff at the state level, attempts to overturn things at the state level. It failed. There was a transition of power, and Trump is still in charge of the Republican Party. The Republican Party is basically whitewashing that. The Democratic Party is not making a huge deal of it. No. I think they have a committee, which is good, but the vocal person on it is Liz Cheney. Maybe that makes sense from a sort of tactical point of view for the Democrats. Let her be the front person, so to speak. But it's not, as you say, Biden doesn't talk about it much. Voters don't say they're sick of hearing about it, and Democrats keep telling each other it's the kitchen table issues, which it may be. I mean, that's but it is, if you step back and say, what's the biggest thing that's happened over the last year? Correct me, what do you think? I mean, I would say it's more the Trump's continued and maybe even greater than ever dominance of the party, or at least Trumpism's dominance, that, this idea that there was going to be a snapback after Trump lost, That's the biggest thing that hasn't happened, it seems to me.
Right.
And then there's the Biden administration. So say a word about the Biden administration, say a word about the Republicans. Where are we? November, what is it, February 2022?
Yeah, well, I would say clearly, Biden is struggling enormously, approval rating in the low 40s. Obviously, the ceiling for a president is lower than it used to be. We're not going to get back to Ronald Reagan, the president whose administration you worked for, that had a 59% share of the vote in 1984. That isn't really possible. Where did Biden start? At like 53? But he's down in the low 40s now, and he's down there. There are several factors. One is clearly frustration among Democrats that he has not been able to pass the agenda that he promised, and he hasn't figured out a way, and maybe there was no way, but he certainly has not figured out a way to get around Manchin and Sinema in the Senate. But the biggest factor by far of why his approval is down, and this may sound like a syllogism, is because the share of the country who say that we're on the wrong track is up, right? I mean, the Americans are uneasy about the direction of the country. Initially in his presidency last summer, you would say that was probably COVID above all. And now I think it's pretty clearly, if you look at the polling, inflation above all. I mean, inflation, we have not had sustained serious inflation very often in this country. But when we have, it's been something of an invasive plant species, as I like to say. It drives out everything else. And so even though there's a lot of good news on the economy, and maybe that good news will, matter more to people if and when the cloud of inflation passes. But right now, inflation is just blocking the sun. It's blocking everything else. And so the empirical question, look, and this is not, the trajectory that Biden is on is not unique. Reagan in 1980 came in with at a moment when most of the country was deeply concerned and unsatisfied about the direction of the country. Clinton came in 93 at a moment when most of the country was, unsatisfied, saying we were on the wrong track. Obama, even more so in 2009 in the aftermath of the Great Recession. And if you look at the polling historically, after they came in each case, there was a brief rally effect that the new president was going to kind of lift the gloom, dispel the clouds, and things are going to get better. And guess what? Things did not get better as fast as people hoped or expected, or even if they did get better, in Clinton's case, they actually did get quite a bit better in the economy. People did not perceive it to be happening. And so after this initial burst of optimism, wrong track, the sense that the country's on the wrong direction, went up, presidential approval went down, and their party had a really bad midterm in 82, 94, and 2010. It really is almost the exact same trajectory for all three of them. And then in the second half of their term, the economy kind of smoothed out. People got somewhat more, not even vastly more, somewhat more optimistic about the direction of the country. Their approval rating went back up to 50% or above. Reagan the highest, Clinton followed, and then Obama, and they all won a second term. So I say that, without question, Biden is following the first part of this curve. We had a very high wrong track because of COVID. He comes in, there was a burst of optimism, and then largely because of Delta originally, and then gradually as the year went on, inflation also, that optimism, the balloon was punctured. People became more pessimistic about the direction of the country, and his approval rating went down. I'm not surprised by that. It's going to be hard for him to turn it around before November of 2022, although he can do better than he is now. But the real question to me is, okay, if he's following the first half of this curve on the way down, is it within his power to follow the second half of the curve if and when people get more optimistic about what's going on? In other words, has there been any independent damage done to Biden in the eyes of the public that would prevent him from recovering the way that Reagan, Clinton, and Obama did if and when people get more optimistic about the way things are going? He's not the politician they are. He's not the skilled communicator they are. But has the public made an independent judgment about him? Either he's not competent, he's too old, he's not inspiring, that would prevent him from recovering if things get better. And, I think the answer is probably no. They have not made that judgment. But until we see, and by the way, the CBS poll this week was the first time with the Omicron cases going down that we began to see an improvement in the share of people saying the country is, things are okay. So, that's where we are. I mean, when you have the White House attitudes about the president loom over everything. It's very hard anymore to run away from that in any election, the midterm or the presidential year election. So unless Biden recovers some, Democrats are not going to recover some. And the issue is not, can he get back to 50 in time for November 2022? Because that's not going to happen. Can he get back to 46, 47? That would be a very different environment than where he is right now.
And just one more word then on 2022, and then we look ahead a little more, which is, do you think there are wild cards out there that could change the dynamics? I mean, there's so many other things have been screwy in the last few years. I take the analogy is very good. And if you go back into history, it's even more persuasive. Yeah. First term off, your elections are off and so forth. But there are things, will the Republicans nominate wacky enough candidates in some key states and maybe some key congressional districts that they lose, or that it spills over to the general image of the party? That does happen as well, right? You may not be in Marjorie Taylor Greene's district, you may not be in Missouri if Eric Greitens is the Senate candidate, but you hear about it and you think, geez, these people are a little extreme, to say the least. Roe v. Wade, the courts. I mean, what do you think that stuff probably just gets swamped by the general, if people are worried about the country and not so thrilled with the Biden administration?
Yeah. I want to come back to that question and I want to ask you a little bit about this issue of whether extremists on the right can color the perception of the Republican Party in the same way that Republicans successfully tarred a broad range of Democrats with the most extreme voices on the left. And we'll come back to that. Look, since 1870, Republicans have to win 5 seats to win the House, right? Since 1870, in all of the midterms that we've had, first and second term midterms, there have only been 4 elections where the president's party has not lost at least 5 seats. Okay, so 1934, 1962, 1998, and 2002, and all of them had a big, unusual, exogenous factor, right? The Depression and the New Deal, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Clinton impeachment, and the 9/11. So history says it's really hard not to lose the House in 2022. But there is a big difference between losing 8 or 10 or 12 or even 14 seats and having a chance to win it back in a reasonable time frame, and losing 25 or 35 seats and being in a deep hole. And I think that is the open question. The core, there's a lot of debate among political scientists and even political professionals about why the president's party always does so badly in the midterm. One theory is that, it's a referendum on the president, but if it's a referendum on the president always fails the referendum. I mean, it makes it a little hard for that to be the convincing explanation. I think the explanation that people settle on the most is just a motivation problem, that the party out of power is just feeling more urgent about voting. They're just annoyed all the time about, you're advancing this crazy ideological agenda. Meanwhile, your side is looking at all the things you didn't do, all the things you have failed to do. And so that there is just a turnout differential, which of course for Democrats is compounded by the fact that they are heavily dependent on young voters in particular, who vote a lot less in midterms than in the presidential. So that, you would bet on that sustaining. I mean, that's been the pattern for 150 years, But the big but here is that there's a guy, Mike Podhorzer, who's the senior political advisor to the AFL-CIO, long ran their political department, using data from Catalyst, which is the premier Democratic targeting firm, has calculated that and this is really an incredible number, there are over 90 million separate individuals, is their projection, that came out to vote for Democrats and, in effect, against Trump in one of the last 3 elections, 2016, 2018, and 2020. It's about 10 million more people, actual individuals, who voted Republican in one of those 3 elections. So, for even at a high turnout midterm, if the Democrats got north of 50 million people voting for them, they would do pretty well. 55, they would do very well. So if there is a way to avoid, the usual disparity in turnout in the midterm, and by the way, polling shows the disparity hearty and in place right now, with Republicans, 10 points more likely to say they're very interested in voting than Democrats, because that's been true since, Ulysses Grant in midterms. But if there is a way to avoid it, it is probably to focus on Trump And the idea that a Republican Congress, House or Senate or both, would make it easier for him to return to the White House, whether or not he actually, he actually wins. And so, you'd have to say that the odds are against them holding the House. But I don't even think that's really the issue. I think the issue is, can they keep down their losses, and can they somehow hold the Senate?
Yeah, no, I think I've heard Podhorse's presentation, which, the pool of Democratic voters is just greater than the pool of Republican voters.
Right now it is,
The 3 elections, Hillary and Biden both won the popular vote. The Democrats won the popular vote, obviously, in 2018 when they
by a lot
when they won the House. If they could, in theory, turn out those voters again, who sufficiently alarmed about Republicans, maybe alarmed about the Supreme Court and Roe v. Wade, maybe also a little bit inspired by the Democrats. That seems to be harder, given just that it's tough and COVID and the economy and so forth. You get maybe a little bit more of an even playing field. Redistricting didn't work out so badly for the Democrats. I think there's a little too much fatalism, is my view. I mean, just a little too much of a sense that when you really, the other thing that happened, I'll tell this one quick story for me. So you've done this a million times, Ron, much more detail than I, but there's sort of 2 ways to think about the midterms. One is to just take the macro view. Look, basically, if the president's at 43%, and if the wrong track is this, and they're going to lose, 15 to 25 seats. The other way is to go district by district and say, what's going to happen here? What's going to happen there? Most of us don't do that because it's a lot of work.
Yeah.
And it presumes what's going on in suburban Cincinnati or on Long Island, and you got to make a million phone calls. And it's hard work. But in 1998, when I was on ABC's Sunday show, I remember maybe 2 or 3 weeks before Election Day, I guess Sam Donaldson said, well, Bill, what do you think? What's going to happen? I said, I don't know. I've looked at the political science stuff. I guess that Republicans will pick up 10, 15, 20 seats. I don't think it'll be huge, but I think they'll pick up, a decent number. And they already controlled the House, but obviously Clinton was president. And Cokie Roberts said, maybe, Bill, I know all that political science stuff, but I'm a kind of a child of the House. Of course, both her parents had been members of Congress, and she was really close to a large number of these people. She's a very old-fashioned kind of reporter and she said, I've been calling all my friends, people I trust in these different districts, people who are not, wishful thinkers. And I don't know. I think the Democrats are okay. I think they could even pick up seats. And I think I'm scared to go back and look at the transcript because I'm sure it'd just be embarrassing. But I think I said something like, oh, come on, Cokie. When is that ever? At that point in 1998, it had not happened since 1934, right?
Yeah, and not since 1934, right?
So I said, oh, come on, Cokie, that's not going to happen. And of course, they picked up 5 seats. I kind of feel like, I know you've done this, of course, but when you go through state by state and district by district, it doesn't feel like a wave or a slaughter. Now, sometimes you can go through it doesn't feel that way now in February, and then by September, all kinds of people you thought were safe are suddenly going under, right? And
well, so that's the story of the wave, right? I mean, that really is the wave. It's people who have no reason. And look, maybe
my sort of district by district, sort of state by state thing isn't will end up just succumbing to history and to the wave. That's the question, I suppose.
Yeah, I'm more in the first camp. I mean, I don't think Biden has to get back to 50, but I think he has to be a little better than he is now. And by the way, that doesn't have to necessarily mean that he is improving with the broad public. It also can mean that you can produce if Democrats, we were just talking about before, Democrats could produce a composition of the electorate that is not reflective of the broad public. I mean, Biden's approval rating could be higher on Election Day than it is in a poll of the public overall on Election Day because of who votes. And, again, I mean, part of the challenge here is you alluded to part of the challenge. There isn't a lot. There are a lot of reasons for Democrats to feel discouraged. They've gotten a lot done. They've gotten more done than they get credit for. But the things that they've touted the most that they were going to get done, they haven't gotten done. I mean, and the 2 biggest ones, some version of Build Back Better and voting rights. And, how much can you blame Biden for that? Or maybe Manchin and Sinema simply were never going to let him or any Democrat do it. I don't know. But I think that fear is more likely to be a motivator for Democratic voters than kind of joy after these 2 years. But fear is real. I mean, I do believe that most of those 90 million people came out in the last 3 elections to vote more against Trump than to vote for universal pre-K or because they thought Biden was such a compelling leader. I think they viewed Trump as a clear and present danger to everything they prize about America. And if Biden has chosen by and large to kind of look forward, doesn't want, but I'm not sure that is electorally the right strategy for Democrats. I mean, I still think that the fear of what a Republican Congress will do to help Trump undermine democracy is probably their best weapon in the midterm. What do you think?
So I think the question is, can you really scare people at a Republican Congress when you control the White House? Because it's not like they can pass legislation really much over Biden's veto. They can do some embarrassing investigations and stupid stuff. And Hillary, I suppose they can look at the Hillary Clinton campaign again, but I mean, it's a little hard to get people really alarmed maybe about that. So I think that's one advantage the party out of power has. They're not as scary because they don't control the White House. And so it's unified government that scares people. Oh. I do think the fire bell in the night on this, and you and I discussed it, I think that weekend after the election, was what happened down ballot in 2020. Now, for all the people who turned out, and Biden won pretty comfortably, and it turned out to vote against Trump, some of them switched back and voted Republican down ballot. And the Republicans picked up, 12 seats, I think, in the House, while Biden won the presidency from the Republican Party. That very rarely happens. That the party taking over the White House loses seats, and a couple in California, I think. And people were surprised. I mean, Trump went around the country saying, we're going to win the House, and people thought he was crazy. And they came kind of pretty close, And that showed the degree of damage, I guess, that's been done to the Democratic brand down ticket, or to the lack of damage to the Republicans, the ability of voters to compartmentalize a little bit. I don't know, but in retrospect, I think if this goes badly for the Democrats in 2020 was, and then Georgia came through and the Democrats heaved a giant sigh of relief and were thrilled to win the Senate 50-50. But of course, that was pretty close too, and a little flukish. So, in retrospect, 2020 was a bit of a warning sign, perhaps, that all was not as well with the Democratic Party as Democrats thought.
And in fact, I mean, obviously Democrats were freaked out by that, but also freaked out by how close Wisconsin and Pennsylvania and Michigan stayed, and Arizona. I think those four. It didn't come together as much as they thought. I think they all believe, though, that their ace in the hole, or their tailwind, was that they could not imagine by the fall of 22 the country would not be in a significantly better place. That, with the vaccine coming online, people thought that COVID would be much more in the rearview mirror. No, I don't think anybody other than Larry Summers really saw the level of inflation coming. And so they thought right track would be going up, not going down. And if it was going up, like those earlier, like maybe like a 34 kind of example, when the objective conditions were still difficult, but there was a perception that things are getting better, that would be, regardless of what they passed or didn't pass, regardless of whether Biden garbled at press conferences or not, that, basically people would be back in their Friday night football games, and they wouldn't be worried about how much the hot dog cost at halftime. And that was going to be what would lift them. Now, that could still be the case for 2024, but it's not likely to be the case for 2022. I mean, we're talking about 77% of the country saying we're in the, going in the wrong direction. That's a catastrophic number. It doesn't have to be that high in November, and it could come down to a point where Democrats can compete. But, the real question is, like, what happens if it's down, it's down 20 points or 30 points by the end of 2023? Is Biden a viable candidate then? And I think the answer is probably still yes, but I don't think it's guaranteed. Do you
think he's likely to run again, and wants to run again? The party will want him to run again.
I think it's sort of like like if he doesn't run again, it will be because it's really difficult to win. I think if it's marginal or solid, I think he will run again myself. I mean, if his approval rating is back, I don't know if 53 is achievable anymore for him, but Bush won re-election with an approval rating at like 48, 49 by raising just enough doubt about Kerry. I think if Biden's back in the high 40s, I think he runs. I think if he's still in the low 40s, I think there will be enormous pressure in the Democratic Party for him not to run. Myself, because Trump is seen as such an existential threat, right? I mean, who in the Democratic coalition what voter or group in the Democratic coalition, I'm going to use a double negative, does not believe that a Trump victory would fundamentally undermine American democracy and lead to all sorts of really scary things. Now, we don't know that he would be the nominee, but I think
say a word about that. What's your handicap the Republicans for a minute? Both Trump and then sort of Trumpism, you know?
Well, I think the nominee will be Trumpist. I think that's without doubt. And I think that, I don't know what's going to happen to him on the legal front between now and then, or whether it will matter. I think it would matter in a general election. I think, if the Fulton County DA indicts him in particular, which does seem possible if they've impaneled a grand jury, I do think that could matter in a general election. But I think that, he will be hard to beat in a Republican primary. I mean, you spent more time in Republican primaries than I have. I think there will be a class of voters who worry that he has too much personal baggage. But I think it will be hard to stop him in a primary if he runs.
Yeah, I tend to agree. And I think we'll have real indications of how strong Trumpism is, and to some degree Trump, this year in the Republican primaries. I mean, there are a ton of primaries with different gradations of Trumpist candidates. And we'll be interesting to see if the voters at the end of the day, gravitate a little bit towards, let's say, Glenn Youngkin-ish,
Right. But speaking of Trumpism versus Trump, just to make this very literal, if Trump doesn't run or if Trump falters, wouldn't DeSantis be the overwhelming favorite at that point?
Assuming things go well, I guess, well enough in Florida.
I mean, how much worse could they have gone in terms of the
I know, but I mean, you'll have a great day. I think even if Trump runs, there'll be a bunch of other people running. It's not like they're just going to give it to him. So there'll be the Hogan-Cheney lane, which is probably hopeless, but, principles stand against it all. There'll be a Chris Christie sort of pretty against the second term for Trump, but not quite willing to break fundamentally. There'll be, I guess, we will see if DeSantis runs or not. I assume not if Trump runs. But there could be a Youngkin type lane of a kind of, Trump acquiescent, but not, but also business, sellable. So kind of businessmen who don't want Trump style. And certainly if Trump doesn't run, it could be pretty wide open. But then it could also be people, as it were, to the right of Trump. If Trump doesn't run, the idea that everyone else is going to be more respectable.
I'm not sure.
Tucker Carlson could run, or some Josh Hawley, of course, Cruz, even a Marjorie Taylor Greene, Don Jr. I don't know. Do we if Trump doesn't run? I think Don Jr. can get 20% of the vote in the Republican primary. I don't think he can get 40 or 50, but I mean,
DeSantis is to the right of Trump, isn't he?
In a way, right? On vaccine, I think, yeah.
Yeah, and on the what they're doing, which maybe we'll come back to. I mean, the legislative agenda in Florida over the last year.
So let's talk about the actual Republican Party. I mean, the largest states the Republican Party is governing are Texas and Florida.
Right.
That's probably the beating heart of the Republican Party, as much as any two states are, wouldn't you say, at this point? I mean, right. And plus a little bit the Midwestern states where they're competitive, like the Michigans and the Wisconsins. And in all those states, I would say, I think is what you were about to say, I mean, the governing agenda seems pretty radical, right?
Much more than, I think I've been doing this since the early 80s. You've been doing it since roughly then too. Yeah. I would say the 2021 and now 2022 legislative session in the Republican controlled states is by far the biggest lurch to the right that we have seen. 81, you didn't get the chance because Democrats still control most of the legislatures, but even 2011 in the aftermath of the Tea Party and those gains. And what's really striking about what we're watching in a broad array of Republican controlled states is that the agenda is moving to the right, but it's also shifting from kind of business conservative to Fox News conservative. I mean, Tucker Carlson seems like he is programming, like the legislative sessions are like an episode of his show in terms of what they are focusing on. If you kind of look across Texas, Florida, Georgia, Arizona, Iowa, South Carolina, just Alabama, we are seeing, obviously, the thing that's gained the most visibility are all the laws making it harder to vote and increasing partisan control over election administration. But many of these same states are passing 15-week or 6-week bans on abortion. Arizona and Florida, I think, voted on them today, both of them. Virtually, I think 13 Republican-controlled states so far, but possibly there are 23 states that Republicans, by the way, have unified control of. But 13 of them have passed laws limiting how teachers can talk about race or gender issues in the classroom. And now you have the Florida Don't Say Gay bill, which would prevent you from even kind of acknowledging, LGBTQ things, communities exist. There are multiple states, Tennessee, Florida, others, Texas, that are moving to restrict transgender athletes. There are multiple states that are loosening gun control laws so that you don't have to go through any training or permitting to have concealed carry. Multiple states that are increasing penalties for people engaged in public protest and or immunizing drivers who run over people during public protests. So there is I'm still trying to understand exactly why this is all happening. I think it is largely a kind of a red flag. Don't count me, count me out from a democratic national control government. But I think a lot of it also is that these governors and legislators see this as the way to address the agenda of the Trump coalition, which is less about, cutting taxes and things like that than it is kind of standing for a particular vision of what America is and who runs America, essentially a conservative white Christian vision of America. And as I said before, what's really striking is that the business community in these states is not really raising much objection because their interests are being taken care of in terms of taxes and regulation. And even though they kind of are out there, expressing their support for Black History Month and access to voting, none of them are getting in the way of this stuff. And so we're heading for a situation where we're going back to a pre-1960s America, where your basic civil rights and civil liberties are going to vary more state by state than they have at any point in the last 60 years, since Earl Warren and that court kind of engineered the whole rights revolution that nationalized the right to privacy, the right to abortion, the right to a council, one man, one vote, one person, one vote, all of the rights revolution, gay marriage. We're heading back to a world in which what the basic civil rights look like in half the country is going to look radically different than what it does in the other half of the country. And I think Biden has been, and his Justice Department has been incredibly dilatory and slow to acknowledge the magnitude or find any strategy to even call public attention to the magnitude of what's happening.
And what strikes me is the degree to which my Republican neighbors in Northern Virginia, who mostly would be unsympathetic to a lot of these Trumpy actions, find them sort of distasteful, maybe even a little dangerous, somehow don't ultimately take them very seriously, or they still think, look, but I can vote for Republicans. The ones here are okay. Youngkin's not going to do most of this. When he does some of this stuff, it's more just performative. It's not really going to change the Virginia schools, which are good. UVA.
He's doing the tip line.
Yeah, he is. He is on the bubble, let's say, of doing the stuff. And, but I know people in Florida, as you do, and in Texas, there are a heck of a lot of upper middle class Republicans in the suburbs of Tampa and Sarasota and in Miami. There are a heck of a lot of middle class Republicans in Houston and Dallas and elsewhere who are, pretty conservative, maybe socially more conservative than you all out in LA or people here in Northern Virginia or New York, but still not. But the degree to which they think this stuff won't really be taken serious somehow, or won't really do much damage, or they maybe deep down, I was saying this to someone else after you and I talked this afternoon to prepare for this, and then I was telling someone else about our conversation, and she said, well, maybe they sort of agree with it deep down, maybe they don't really, think it's that bad, and they really don't like some of these changes, and they really don't like all the what they would regard as political correctness and wokeness and all. And let those people feel a little bit. I wonder how much of that's going on beneath the surface.
Well, because I wanted to ask you a question, because certainly, and this used to be something you did for a living. I mean, Republicans have been very successful at making a broad range of Democrats pay for the views of their most ideologically extreme members, whether it's defund the police or eliminate ICE or open the border or, some of
San Francisco Board of Education.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. Now we have a situation where we have Republicans filibustering the January 6th Commission, objecting to a no-fly list for people who have literally attacked, flight attendants. In Florida, saying the "Don't Say Gay" bill, where you can't even acknowledge the existence of LGBTQ people. A Texas bill that deputizes ordinary citizens in a kind of vigilante lawsuits against people engaged in abortion, which now DeSantis is adopting to education in Florida. Marjorie Taylor Greene, and the Gazpacho police. There's a lot of extreme stuff happening in the Republican Party in the wake of Trump, but it doesn't seem to work in the same way to make a Steve Chabot or the equivalent in Cincinnati pay for that. Why is it harder for Democrats to attach that to Republicans than vice versa?
I mean, I think it's a good observation. I would just add, incidentally, what about the vaccine? I mean, if we just,
you
told me 5 years ago, one party is going to be, for various reasons, whipped up into a resistance to a vaccine that clearly works in the middle of a serious pandemic that will now has now killed almost 1 million Americans. And most of those people in that party will get vaccinated, but a very big chunk won't, 30, 40% of Republicans. And Republican elected officials will get maneuver themselves into a position of basically justifying anti-vax stuff, if not promoting it. Certainly we can't, put a thumb on the scale to favor those who are vaccinated. That's like what's forbidden by current Republican orthodoxy. If you tell me the other party is going to be normal, if I can put it that way, and like 90% of them are going to get vaccinated, and maybe they'll make some mistakes in being too cautious at times in terms of opening the schools and all that, but whatever, and what is that they're not, and they're going to win the House. You know what I mean? And there will be individuals in there who've been responsible, House candidates. There'll be many who've been quiet, I would say, sort of not irresponsible, but not very courageous and standing up to the anti-vax types. And there'll be some who are just totally irresponsible.
Josh Mandel. I mean, civil.
Yeah, and it doesn't seem to spill over much at all. I mean, maybe it's I do think the Republicans have a huge advantage with Fox and the discipline of the kind of propaganda that comes out of right-wing media, social media. They were much earlier in figuring out how to weaponize that. The Democrats are more, all over the place, as they always are. I do think there's a funny thing with the Democrats, and I think you alluded to this earlier, when they're incumbents. And one of the questioners I saw just made this point too, which is, if you're progressives, you're the party in power. You're supposed to, as you said, wrong track. The key, ever since I came to Washington and began to really get involved in politics, the key statistic you look at if you're in the incumbent party and you're in bad shape, if people think it's on the wrong track. But if you're really a progressive, you're not too happy about the way things are, because income inequality hasn't been fixed yet. And there still are systemic injustices. And, people, I was on a call the other day, I probably shouldn't say exactly why, but anyways, it was a lot of older radicals. It was kind of a funny group for me to be involved in. It was a personal thing for someone and kind of tribute to someone. And these are people who had fought for civil rights in the early 60s. They'd been anti-war, they'd been feminists, they'd been environmentalists, they'd been for gay rights. There was no sense of celebration. And look, whatever you think of Trump and the regression that you've mentioned, it's not like America today is the America we had in 1960 in all these respects, right? And Joe Biden's about to nominate a Black woman to be on the Supreme Court, and I won't even bother going into everything else, right? And there's very little, and maybe there's something about the progressive, mindset that makes it hard to take credit for things. You look complacent, and then the moderates are always worrying about the progressives. So the Democrats don't convey any sense of, things. We're sort of the party that wants things to go in the right direction, in the 21st century direction. It's tricky. Sometimes we err a little bit one side or the other, but we're at least directionally kind of trying to steer this country in a sane way. And we're not just screaming and yelling and demonizing other Americans. You wouldn't think that would be that hard to convey as a message, but I don't know that it's conveyed. It was conveyed in 2020 by Biden, I'd say, for about 5 months, Should
we hear what the audience is?
Yeah, let me ask you a couple of questions here, and which I've got, many of them have been sent to me. Maybe this would just be precise, since you follow closely. I mean, who could be, you sort of said, well, if Biden may not run, if it looks difficult and someone else has to be Trump, but who's the someone else? Is it obvious? Is there a slate? Is it wide open? I mean,
look, I mean, it's really a tough, if Biden doesn't run and you have a vice president who is, young and energetic and a woman of color, but based in part on Biden's performance in 2020 in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, a lot of Democrats would doubt that she could hold those states against Trump. And her own numbers have been, kind of weak throughout the presidency. Can you bypass, a Black woman vice president when African-American women are so essential to the Democratic base? I guess I feel like if it would be hard for a white man to displace her. I mean, I haven't really fully thought it through, but I've got to think that if Biden doesn't run and Democrats are not convinced that Harris can beat Trump, and I think there'd be a lot of Democrats that she would have to convince of that, who would start off as skeptical, that you'd probably need another person of color. I don't know, Cory Booker. I mean, I don't know.
Governor, I thought our friend Matt Bai had an interesting piece saying that, someone who sort of could say Biden did a great job for the country. He saved us from Trump. Yeah. But time for a change. Yeah. I'm Jared Polis, the governor of Colorado, and I think that there's a real space for that, except that if you have the Black woman vice president who wants it, bypassing her is a very fraught exercise in this Democratic coalition, because there are going to be a lot of people who are going to feel like, wait a minute, we went with the 78-year-old white guy and it didn't turn out. If he doesn't run, it's going to be because it didn't turn out so great. And you keep telling us to wait. That's why I kind of think that, you could make a case for Sherrod Brown as a great successor to Biden, but I just think that's really hard to do if Harris wants. I don't know, maybe she doesn't, if she wants the nomination. If she doesn't actively seek it, then it's more wide open. If she doesn't seek it, Newsom might run. I mean, I could. Yeah, I mean, governors are traditionally good, often have been good candidates, and California's the largest state, and Polis has been a good governor in Colorado. There are a couple of governors in purple or even red.
Cooper could run.
Cooper in North Carolina. I mean, it wouldn't be in the old days. If you were looking for the Bill Clinton model, you might look at those people. I just don't know. And also, do they have to get national attention somehow, and maybe have a signature issue or two? And it's hard. Yeah. But of course, who knows what the world will look like by then with Russia?
Yeah, no, that's right. Because look, I do think, though, one thing we do know is that there will be a part of the Democratic Party that wants to turn the page, that was, kind of always. And look, Biden described himself in that event in Michigan, the last event before really COVID shut down the world. He described himself as a bridge. And there will be plenty of Democrats who are ready to cross that bridge in 2024. But it's also possible that the kind of the fear of Trump, and if people believe he is the only one that can hold off Trump, he might be able to hold things together for more.
Let me combine two questions here in a way, which also is something we should close by making sure we discuss, which is, how worried are you about actually American liberal democracy and, basic civil rights, basic democratic order here in this country? There are, just how worried are you? And B, how fluid is the situation? That is, if the court overturns Roe, and if there's, huge, and the court does other things with 5-4 and 6-3 votes, how much pressure will be there in the Democratic Party that we can't just sit here and accept that this is the court for the next 10 years? And what about, expanding the size of the court? I kind of think people are underestimating now. It's been Biden's damped things down, which I personally think was prudent and probably sensible for now. But people are probably underestimating how crazy 2023 could be, don't you think? Yes. If you get the Republican House and anyway.
Okay, so on each of those, I just wrote a piece in the Atlantic last week about this. It was called the Supreme Court's dead hand, and that was a phrase that Franklin Roosevelt used in 1926. Because when what we had in the 20s and particularly in the 20s was you had a court dominated by conservative justices who were named by Republican presidents in the early part of the 20th century, who systematically struck down much of the progressive legislation from around the country, and then applied that same kind of wrecking ball to the early years of the New Deal and struck down a great deal of what Roosevelt passed in the first few years. Very similarly, we had in the 1850s a Supreme Court where 7 of the 9 justices had been appointed by pro-Southern Democratic presidents, who then in 1857 in the Dred Scott decision struck down the platform of, essentially rendered unconstitutional the platform of the Republican Party, just as it was as emerging as the national majority. Roosevelt's confrontation ended with his threat to enlarge the court, and the court kind of backed down. 2 of the members switched, the famous switch in time that saved 9, and started voting for the New Deal. And then some of them retired. He got control of the court. The 1850s confrontation ended because the South seceded. I'm not really sure how that would have gone, actually. It would have been quite a test if the Republican Party had tried to implement its platform preventing the expansion of slavery to the territories and the Supreme Court had struck it down. But it became moot because the South seceded, and the price of getting back in was the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment that actually did end slavery. So I think you're right that, like, the idea that, and the other one other, essentially in both of those cases, you had a Supreme Court majority that was impaneled, nominated and confirmed by an earlier majority in the country, an earlier version of the country that was telling the ascending majority that you can't have your agenda, right? I mean, it was saying no to the New Deal majority just as it was becoming the dominant force in the country. It was saying no to the Republican Party agenda just as it was becoming the dominant force, at least in the free states. Democrats are not exactly in that position, but the fact is that you have the Republicans who have chosen and confirmed these justices do represent the parts of the country that are least touched by all the demographic, cultural, and economic changes of the 21st century. And the idea that these rising generations are going to sit there for 10, 12, 15 years while this majority strikes down everything they care about, abortion rights, potentially, eventually, again, gay rights. They allow the states to radically diverge in what voting rights and civil rights look like. I don't see it. Something is going to give between now and then. And the answer of how concerned I am about democracy, I would say a lot, because you don't need tanks in Lafayette Square, although Trump came close, to fundamentally change the character of the democracy. I mean, you can do it by tilting the laws in a way that make it very hard for the party, once they are in power, to be voted out. I think that's what we are seeing now in the red states, kind of a revolution from below. And in the 60s, the segregationists tried to push Washington away, but it was mostly defensive. I mean, they weren't trying to impose segregation on New York and California. They just wanted Washington to let them keep it in Alabama and Georgia. This is more like the 1850s, where the where the South was trying to use their control of the Supreme Court and the Senate to expand slavery through the whole country. I mean, the red states are not, like, what's happening in Texas is not just about who's going to be governor of Texas, or in Georgia, or in Florida, or in Arizona. It's about changing the rules so that you tilt enough states that you control the national balance.
Well, and also, I mean, the extent to which what's happening in states like Michigan and Pennsylvania, the radicalization of the Republican Party in those states,
yes,
those Republican parties look more like the Texas Party. That's not, I can't believe that's where the voters of those states are,
And look, if because of dissatisfaction, if wrong track stays high, and Republicans elect the governors in any of Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, they will impose Texas, Georgia, Florida election laws on those states, because they will probably hold the legislature.
I feel like I should, in the last 2 minutes, say something a little, well, I guess on the other hand, we could pass electoral count reform, I think, which would strengthen some of the guardrails. We'll see what happens in the elections, but certainly I think Republican candidates could disqualify themselves, and the Democrats could hold the Senate, for example.
Yes,
Trump remains unpopular. If you just look at the numbers nationally, it's not like he's ever won a majority of the vote or violated the vote in a presidential election. And, for all that you can try to skew the voting in some of these states, Democrats have gotten better at turning out their voters, obviously. What Podhorzer says about the 90 million people who've now voted Democratic in the last 3 elections. The degree to which the Democratic Party is not that's an interesting question. As a political party, is it up to the job that it has a difficult job, to be fair to it. It has to govern normally, do all the things you have to do if you're managing a disparate and difficult coalition, and it has to defend democracy at the same time. It's unusual, actually. I feel like they get kind of a bum rap in a way. People, oh, those Democrats, they can't do anything. But it's a pretty tough thing they've got to manage. They can't look hysterical. They've got the, but on the other, they got to fight for these things. They're not. Biden has a tough.
And can I add real quick before we let everybody go? There is, and you know this as well as I, there is a real debate among the students of democracy and the practitioners in these countries that have undergone democratic backsliding around the world. There really are two camps about how you deal with a quasi-authoritarian party or a party that is moving your country toward authoritarianism. I mean, one camp is that you call it out and you confront it directly, but probably the dominant view is not that, right? Is that you can't make this relevant and tangible to enough voters, and that even as the other side is trying to change the rules, you have to engage in what one political scientist called to me normal politics. I mean, you have to focus on healthcare and the minimum wage, and in this case, COVID, and that is the way to deal with authoritarian parties. I'm not fully convinced, but I would say that Democrats are not the only ones struggling with this. Parties have dealt with this in other countries and come out in different places on it, like Italy, for example. I think they ultimately, with Berlusconi, they ultimately beat him not by talking about his many scandals, but by like the price of bread kind of stuff. So it is a real issue. And the answer may be different, Bill, in 22 than 24. Right? I mean, it may be that it's very hard to make this relevant in 22 when it's translated into the Attorney General of Arizona or Herschel Walker in Georgia. It may be a whole other thing if Trump or a Trumpist is the nominee. And at that point in 24, I do think there are more voters who will look at January 6th as kind of a lost style flash forward. And I think it does lower Trump's ceiling a little bit. I personally believe that it does. Not catastrophically, but I think measurably. So, I'm not in the school of thought that like we are inexorably on the road to Hungary, but I think you have to be, clear-eyed about how big a risk there is. And so many of our institutions, from the Chamber of Commerce to the 3 television major networks, are not. And we kind of need a paradigm shift, a code switch, where people are kind of acknowledging the times that we are living in.
Very well said. A very good note to end on. And we've made this switch before in our history, and so maybe let's hope we will again. And I think there are some indications that some people are at least working for that. So, Ron Brownstein, thank you for joining me tonight. Thank you all for joining. Next week, Bart Gellman, who's a friend of Ron's and mine, who wrote a terrific article in the Atlantic, is going to be here, and on actually this threat to Trump's next coup. January 6th was a precursor, not the end of something, but the beginning of something. And actually, Ben Ginsburg and Bob Bauer will talk about what I mentioned, the Electoral Count Act and other things. So really a terrific lineup here coming ahead. So thank you all for joining us. And Ron, again, thanks for being with us.
Thanks, Bill. Great to be with you.